Hello, my name is Martin and welcome back to another video. So this is St Leonard's Church in the parish of Middleton. St Leonard's Church is very old and it's quite unique because of its wooden steeple. But the graveyard is equally just as old as you would imagine, and it's seen some things in the past. Now there's a bit of ancient folklore here in Middleton, a story that goes back that I was told as a child and was probably passed on for generations. It's difficult to know how true it is, but my uncle swears that the story is true. Many years ago, probably the early 1800s, the mid 1800s, there was a gentleman known only in folklore as Old Kanky, and he lived at the back of this cemetery, and he'd sit by day and clock the funerals that were taking place in the cemetery during the day. Well, because he lived at the back of the cemetery, he lived opposite a Ginnel, a secret path into the cemetery, and he used that path at night to sneak the back way into the cemetery by dead of night. Why would he do that? Because Old Kanky was a grave robber. Now the Ginnel that he used to use to take his back route into the cemetery at the dead of night later became known as Kanky Ginnel. Is it still there today? So let's go and see if we can find Kanky Ginnel. So I think somewhere along this path, because we're right at the very back of the graveyard now, and somewhere along this path there's a little offshoot, probably to the right, and it goes down into Kanky Ginnel. I'm not quite sure, I need to keep walking. Found it, the little tiny entrance, the concealed entrance into the graveyard. This leads to Kanky Ginnel. Of course, for Kanky, it was night time when he needed to spring into action, for it was night time where he could earn his money. And I'm sure down in Manchester there'd be some contact waiting for him by the banks of the River Irk, waiting for Kanky to turn up with the grisly cargo. And from his cottage that was just at the bottom of the Ginnel, he'd gather the tools of his trade. Up the steep Ginnel, the slippery cobbles, just with the light of his lantern, the Ginnel that would later be named after him, and people would doubt his even existence. But nonetheless, into the dark, dank cemetery, he needed to remember where the fresh graves were. He'd find the grave, and his work began. Now let me tell you about grave robbing, or the history of grave robbing. In the 1700s, many people were sentenced to death for the most trivial of reasons, and once they'd been sentenced to death and killed by capital punishment, the bodies were allowed to be taken away and dissected by the ever-expanding schools of medicine. Come the 1800s, the early 1800s, and things changed, and people weren't sentenced to death for the most trivial of reasons. It was more heinous crimes like murder. So whilst you had this situation where the medical schools and the schools of surgery were ever expanding and moving into the universities that were beginning to open, the people that were being killed by capital punishment and were available for dissection were less and less. Cue the grave robbers. They'd watch by day, they'd see the funerals, they'd clock where the grave was, and at night time they'd sneak in the cemetery and do their dirty work. Because there was money in selling corpses to the schools of medicine and surgery, and robbing a grave, believe it or not, was not a serious crime. It was a slap on the wrist, it was a fine. So the amount of money they got for the corpses way outweighed the consequences of the crime, and this cemetery was no exception, because this cemetery had Old Kanky. So how do you rob a grave at the dead of night without making a sound? Well, Kanky and the rest of his ilk had this down to a T. What you do is, at nightfall, you creep into the cemetery unseen. You use a wooden spade, quite common back in the day, and you use a wooden spade so you don't get the sonorous cling of the metal into the cold earth. A wooden spade is much more duller. You dig a hole at the head of the grave, not the whole grave, just a hole at the head, down to the coffin. You smash the coffin open. You tie a rope around the corpse's neck. It could be in a shroud, it could be in its best clothes. And you pull the corpse up through the hole and out of the grave. You throw the corpse over your shoulder. Maybe you've got a mate with you to carry your gear, and you walk back in the dead of night with your grisly cargo down Kanky Ginnel to the River Irk and the boat that's waiting for you, and you sail quietly into the night into Manchester to sell your wares. So this is the River Irk, and it's just right at the back of that cemetery. Imagine the riverbank was more flatter to the river. There's the Whitbrook that joins it, and Kanky would have been able to load his boat with his cargo and sail down this way into Manchester through Blakely and Collyhurst and meet his contact. How do you prevent the horror of turning up to the grave of your loved one only to find a hole there at the head of the grave and the body gone? Well, like a lot of things, it depends how much money you had. Some graveyards had like a holding building where they'd hold the corpses till they were suitably decomposed and no longer suitable for dissection. But obviously that cost money. In Scotland they invented the mort safe, which was like an iron grid that went over the grave to prevent grave robbers. Now, don't know how effective it was, but it would certainly slow down the process, and if you were going to pick a grave, you won't pick one with a mort safe on it. I'd love to go and find one of them, because apparently some of them still exist in some of the graveyards, unfortunately not in this one. Or if you were poor, you just got the family to sit round and watch the grave, and probably watch it for 2-3 weeks until you knew the body was no longer suitable for dissection. Tough times, eh? Times of horror. So old, these graves at the back of here. I mean, it's hard to think that each one of these had its own funeral. People stood and there were sort of burials here, you know, long since forgotten graves. But look how it says second class. What did that mean? What on earth did that mean? Right, you try and film in a graveyard late at night with a bloody torch on your head. I don't want to take away the mystery or anything.